So the theory that Kris is the knight has been around for quite a while. It even predates chapter 2. Not only do they wear knight armor, they also act strangely in between chapters, going as far as to create a dark fountain in their own home. By the end of chapter 2, Toby clearly wanted us to wonder, is Kris the knight? I'd like to make it clear that Kris being the knight is an amazing storytelling idea. It opens up a whole avenue of potential plot threads weaving together the conflict between Kris and the player, as well as adding much more suspense to the story. Instead of us being on edge for the entire game waiting for the knight to reveal themselves, we know who the knight is, giving us an advantage, adding much more tension to the story. However, the theory is not without its problems. For one, when we do meet King, he seems intimately familiar with the knight, stating that it is the knight's will to shatter our heart to pieces. Why would the knight want himself to be killed? And wouldn't King recognize Kris anyway? People are quick to defend this by saying that Kris wore different armor, or that the knight didn't even appear at all, and that Kris simply shuffled around the cards, with the fountain interpreting this as a knight appearing to bring chaos to the card kingdom, thus reducing the knight that King sees as just something that's retroactively added to their memory. But come on, that's lame. It diminishes the knight's actions greatly and reduces their threat level. For nearly our entire journey throughout the card kingdom, we are reminded of what the knight's appearance has brought: chaos, political instability. Even Jevel warns that the knight's hand is drifting forward and that a nightmare will awaken in our hearts. For all that to simply be a byproduct of the knight just making a fountain and leaving kinda sucks. So while I understand the reasoning behind it, I still don't like it. This might just come down to personal taste, so for now I'm going to talk about the one thing everyone talks about in regards to Kris being the knight. Let's go over the series of events leading up to the start of chapter 2 that Kris Knighters often bring up. Kris wakes up in the dead of night and creates a dark fountain. Kris wakes up in the morning and goes to school. Kris and Susie talk to Noelle, who suggested to study with her. Kris and Susie goof around in the castle town. Noelle and Birdley enter the computer lab and fall into the dark world. Kris and Susie enter the computer lab, and at the same time, Rousey feels a dark presence and hurries over. The fun gang runs into Queen. This series of events is not comprehensive, but generally this is what needs to happen in order for Kris to be the knight. It seems to check out until you actually awaken in the computer lab at the end of chapter 2. Noelle and Birdley had fallen asleep, with their books placed neatly on the table, suggesting that the knight sprung out from a hidden location to create a fountain. The in-game narration supports this, as when you interact with a closet, it states that a large person could fit inside. Had Kris created a dark fountain between chapters, Noelle and Birdley would probably be asleep by the entrance of the computer lab. Instead, the two fell asleep opposite to Kris and Susie, implying the two were studying right before the appearance of the fountain. Now, people are often quick to provide a counter-argument to this, stating that it's just a minor detail that doesn't mean anything, and that Deltarune is full of utilitarian stylistic choices that don't make sense in real life. There's even a word for it, a magic xylophone, a theory that relies on fringe details that the author didn't intend. It originates from a Simpsons episode, in which a fan asks how in a very specific episode of an animated TV show, a character was able to hit a xylophone twice on the same note and produce different sounds. Obviously this is an animation mistake and not intended to be analyzed as lore, and yet the fan asks whether the xylophone is meant to be magical. In short, to invoke magic xylophone is to suggest a theory is being based on evidence and details that are most likely unintentional. Things like the clocks in Hometown having different orientation, or the sprite of the red soul being different in a battle screen compared to the end of the chapters. However, in my opinion, comparing Noelle and Birdley waking up with their books on a table to something as minor as color palettes in a battle screen is a huge false equivalence. The game directly gives attention to these details. Having Noelle and Birdley wake up near the door wouldn't be much of a harder thing to do, really. And Birdley could have just as easily picked his books up from the floor. Toby could have even made a better joke about it than the one he used currently, proving that this is an intentional detail. In short, calling this a magic xylophone is a bad faith argument in my eyes, the equivalent of plugging your ears and screaming to pretend that counter evidence doesn't exist. I don't think it's productive to theory discussions. Anyway, consider this my drawing a line in the sand. I'm not going to spend too much time on this subject because ultimately if by this point you think uttering the phrase magic xylophone is a valid argument in favor of Kris being the knight, absolutely nothing will change your mind. So with that, we move on. So I'm not going to get too hung up on this concept as I've made an entire video about it, but in short, the Dark World seems to act as a reflection of the fountain's creator, evidenced mainly by Queen saying that the knight put their will into their knife to create the fountain, and Rousey saying that each dark fountain has a will that all darkeners must adhere to. This seems to be evidenced by the fact that the castle town is very different from the other Dark Worlds we have visited, from form to function, and we know the knight didn't create the grand fountain. So if Kris was in fact not the knight, Chapter 3 would be noticeably different from the other Dark Worlds we needed to venture through, focusing less on the wider narrative of the knight causing chaos, Gaster, and everything else. Overall, the chapter would be less story-focused, and would act almost like a standalone Dark World, and going by the interpretation that creating dark fountains is analogous to creating fiction, Chapter 3 would be most likely a representation of fan fiction. By the way, I predicted this 2 years ago, long before the Spamton sweepstakes, but then something unexpected happened. The summer newsletter came out, a whole month after I posted my video talking about how the Dark World works, in which Toby himself confirmed my predictions about Chapter 3, specifically about how the chapter will be more gameplay oriented rather than focusing on the large narrative at play throughout the entire game. Initially I was surprised, to say the least. Even though my channel is relatively small compared to the giants currently making Deltarune content, I can't help but wonder if he added this to the newsletter in response to my video. Anyway, what matters here is that Toby Fox confirmed that Chapter 3 is going to be structurally and narratively distinct from the other chapters, while Chapter 4 is going to be a standard chapter. In other words, that fountain will be created by the knight. This also means that the knight didn't create a Chapter 3 Dark World, which means that Kris, without a doubt, is not the knight. If you die, you are greeted with a standard game over screen. Pretty simple, right? However, if you choose to give up, you are greeted with a very specific screen. Then the world was covered in darkness. Here it is, clear as day. If Kris dies, then eventually the roaring happens. The roaring can't happen without the knight making more fountains. And if we die, Gaster tells us the roaring will happen. Gaster needs the entire party alive in order to prevent the roaring from happening. And if anyone knows who the knight is, it's definitely Gaster. This video isn't exactly conclusive by any metric, however that was not my intention going into this video. There are already multiple videos outlining reasons why Kris might not be the knight, mostly going off of Kris's personality, established events in the past, among other things. This video, however, uses cold, hard lore to not just say Kris isn't a knight, but to instead prove that it is fundamentally impossible. I understand that this is a big departure from my usual kind of theory video. Some may even call it slander, so I'm sorry if this video feels insulting. I want to make it clear that I don't hate this theory. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a very interesting scenario with lots of narrative potential for suspense and drama. However, it doesn't seem to be what the game is building towards, so for that reason, I'm discarding it.